Welcome to Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo here at Grand Rapids Community College, and today we have with us the Associate Professor of Israel Studies and International Relations at the James Madison College at Michigan State University, Yael Aronoff. Yael, thank you for being here with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's really nice. So I look forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you. You have spent much of your academic life devoted to studies relating to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians and problems associated with that part of the Levant itself. Can you tell us how you really became interested in this early on?
Yeah. Well, as with many of us, it's kind of personal experiences that spurred it. So I grew up in Israel largely the first 10 years of my life and was there during the 73 war. They just had their 40th anniversary of that. And I spent part of my high school there during the first Intifada or Palestinian uprising. And so I'd come back during college in the summer to do various internships there. And then that evolved over time as I did a PhD in international relations and was looking at kind of conditions under which wars end. That would be particularly interesting to look at the conditions under which this 100-year-old conflict could end and the role of political leaders in possibly bringing that to an end.
Well, tell me, how do you believe your perspective is different from one who remained in Israel, did not migrate to the United States or elsewhere? How is your perspective any different from a typical Israeli, let's say?
I think it is very different because, and at this point I've spent most of my life in the United States. I've traveled broadly. I've worked in our own government for a couple of years. So I look at it very much through American lenses as well, and through kind of US interests in resolving the conflict. And I think that it allows me to a greater extent to no one is completely objective, but to try to stand back and look at it from a multiplicity of lenses.
Well, it's very intriguing because it doesn't appear to me there are many academics like you that have been able to adopt that approach, still having that experience from childhood of residing in the Levant, regardless of whether one was on one side or the other. And so this is a very unique perspective. It really is.
To some respects it is. On the other hand, there are a lot of scholars who come at it and they become, I think, sometimes too politicized in the process. So I think it's good to always try to remain as objective as one can and look through as multiple perspectives as one can. And I returned, during lots of trips to do field research there in the past 10 years as well.
And as you've engaged in this field research, what tack are you pursuing? What sort of element of field research, if you will, are you more devoted to than anything else?
Well, I think it's really, I have a kind of, in this particular book that I wrote, I have a kind of a political psychology perspective, so I think it's important to look at the ideologies and personalities and advisors of the various prime ministers and to see why you have these dramatic shifts on the part of some prime ministers who became much more accommodating in trying to pursue negotiations with first the Palestinian Liberation Organization and then the Palestinian Authority, and others who remained kind of more hardline or less flexible in pursuing those negotiations. So I was looking at all those factors and determining that. And one thing that's really interesting to look at is just conducting lots of interviews if you're trying to show these traits over time with their family members, the prime ministers themselves, the people they grew up with, their political opponents. So I think you get lots of insights that you wouldn't just from reading secondhand, academic information. So that was really enlightening and interesting for me. And I also was able to look at party archives. So what people were talking about in closed committee meetings with only 3 other members of their own party, so that one could guess through that kind of research that you get more accurate perceptions as to what they were genuinely thinking and how that thinking evolved and so forth, as opposed to speeches that were written possibly by somebody other than themselves, or that were pre-prepared. So it's a kind of more spontaneous communication that I think adds a lot to trying to figure out what motivated them to make some dramatic changes and others not to. Yeah.
So this is really in many ways a sort of a history, a recent history, by concentrating on the leaders, the main individuals charged with decision making and creating in many ways what Israel is today, and also how Israel relates to much of the world today. It's very fascinating, I think, and that many people in academia are not cognizant of the country's development.
And especially in international relations, even though lots of Americans are very interested in leaders and think they make a big difference in my field, they're often kind of shunted aside as not being as important, either in the field that talks about kind of regional balance of power, kind of dictate that every leader would respond in a similar manner, or in the field of psychology, they say none of us change our minds very often about anything, so that in both respects they kind of expect a new leader or the leader to be replaced for there to be any change. So I think it is kind of interesting to look at it, and as there are ongoing negotiations, luckily today, between Netanyahu and Abu Mazen and Secretary of State Kerry and Martin Indyk and others, I think the particular experiences and perceptions and ideologies of these leaders can make a difference as to the probability of the negotiation success.
Well, you've looked at the current Israeli leader in some detail,
Right.
And I'll ask you. He seems to have alienated many and also developed for himself a strong following. There are very few people that fall in the middle of the road there with
That's
regard to the current prime minister. And we see with him a very brilliant person, I think. I think Penn educated, if I'm not mistaken. You've studied this matter of political psychology associated with him. How much did his father influence him, do you think?
I think it influenced him greatly. I mean, it's kind of interesting because you can never know for sure. I can't make any predictions as to whether these particular negotiations will be successful and how far he will move from his original positions. But of course, the probability, there's certainly a significant possibility of the negotiation succeeding, which I'll talk about this evening in the lecture, but it's not necessarily a probability given some of the things that you brought up, in that his ideology is very much that he got from his father and growing up, which goes back. His father worked for Jabotinsky, who was the forefather of kind of the revisionist movement in Israel.
And a tremendous scholar in history by
Yeah.
by all accords devoted to
Yes,
the Sephardim in Iberia.
Right. So he, but he was also very much part of this revisionist ideology and worked closely with Jabotinsky, and that ideology originally opposed conceding any part of what many of us would call the West Bank, and they would call Judea and Samaria, so that their ideological stance was essentially opposed to the establishment of a Palestinian state in these territories. And therefore, it's easy to see, how coming from that ideological perspective, where just a few years ago, before 2009, Netanyahu was vehemently opposed to the establishment of a Palestinian state and to conceding any territory in the West Bank, that this was heavily influenced by his father. And often he would check speeches. His father just passed away last year. I think it was 101.
Yeah.
And so some people say he would never be able to make greater concessions until his father passed away, because his father was actually critical of his decision in 1996 to support the Oslo process that he had rejected, basically to get elected, because most Israelis supported it. His father was very much against that. When he did make some compromises in the Y agreement and Hebron agreement, his father opposed that as well. So his father was pushing against any further accommodation on the part of his son in the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations.
Those family dynamics are very interesting, and I sometimes think they play a more significant role than many of us realize. And I think of his brother as well, who died in the Entebbe raid, how much his image might influence the current prime minister as well. And he was a true Israeli hero, his brother.
He was. I mean, the Entebbe raid is kind of tremendous success, an example of how to successfully rescue one's hostages from a plane that was landed in Entebbe, Uganda, of course, and his brother, who he was very close to, was the only Israeli special ops person, I believe, that died during the operation and is considered kind of a hero in Israel because, over 100, I don't know the exact number of people were rescued from the plane at that time. So certainly that influenced his tremendous focus on counterterrorism, and it also contributed to his distrust of Yasser Arafat because he blamed Yasser Arafat, of course, for his brother's death. And so it's those close relationships, as you say, that can influence people's perspective and increase their distrust in the adversary at that time as well. On the flip side, family members can really, and those hardliners that I see that actually became more accommodating towards the Palestinians, it was their own family members that often influenced them as well. They often, Yitzhak Rabin and Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak all had wives and children that were far more dovish than themselves. And I think over years and all those many dinners and all that pressure from their family members eventually contributed, it wasn't the main factor, but contributed to them taking political negotiations more seriously and being willing to make more concessions in those negotiations. Whereas with Netanyahu, people say that his wife and his son and his brother-in-law are all more hawkish than he is. So he doesn't have that kind of same kind of family push towards more concessions.
It's very intriguing how these influences can facilitate a diplomatic move, a treaty, an agreement, one way or the other, really. And these happen to be hidden characters behind the major world scenes that have these influences. It's very fascinating. Do you have any insight that you'd like to share concerning any other leaders? You've mentioned Netanyahu. What about Barak?
Yeah, Barak is kind of a fascinating figure. He was considered a war hero in Israel. He had been chief of staff of the military, he had been defense minister. So in the first Palestinian popular uprising that lasted from 86 to 93, he had been defense minister, and he was considered, to be very hardline and using force to put down the uprising. So initially he used live bullets, then rubber bullets, then he had a famous quote of telling soldiers to break bones and so forth. He was responsible for many administrative detentions. So a very hard line response to the uprising in which you had thousands. Peace Now was the largest social movement, a non-governmental organization in Israel that was pushing for a peace agreement. And so thousands of people demonstrated for him to resign because of his harsh policies during the first Intifada. And a mere 5 years later, he had gone through this dramatic shift whereby he was at now a rally in support of the Oslo peace process with the Palestinians. He had signed the Oslo I and Oslo II Accords. He was forming a partnership with Yasser Arafat. And now all those thousands of demonstrators who had asked for his resignation 5 years earlier were now in support of him, in support of his policies, and in support of political solutions to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And unfortunately, as he was singing one of these peace songs, a bullet from an extremist religious Jewish Israeli who thought he should not concede the land hit him, went through the song that he had in his jacket, and he unfortunately, passed away. And many people argue that perhaps had he not been assassinated in 1995, that by now we would have had a peace agreement, because he was forming a stronger partnership with Arafat. Arafat came and paid his condolences to his wife, after he died, and so we'll never know. But it seems like he had the legitimacy and the support of the Israeli public to be able to make serious concessions, and he had a genuine interest in doing so.
Very
Yeah.
fascinating. I'm sure we'll all be looking forward to reading your book that is scheduled to be out
In spring 2014.
spring 2014. And the title is?
When Israeli Hardliners Opt for Peace, The Political Psychology of Prime Ministers. And it's coming out to Cambridge University
What's
Press.
do you have an anticipated project or sequel?
Yeah, I mean, now I'm very interested in initially how wars end, but I'm also interested in kind of means of war and the ethics surrounding means of war. And so also particularly in the Israel's conflict with Hamas in the Gaza Strip and with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then the US's conflicts in Afghanistan and Pakistan, I became increasingly interested in kind of the dilemmas of asymmetric war and how these wars are, wars used to be fought with conventional armies. Now you have these non-state actors that don't abide by international laws regarding laws of war, that don't have distinctive clothing, that hide intentionally among civilians. And I'm looking at investigating how this affects military's responses in these kinds of wars. So how they can how do you measure military effectiveness? How do you measure political effectiveness? How do the militaries best abide by international humanitarian law in trying to fight these wars? How the media and kind of wars in terms of media narratives over these wars shape how you measure political effectiveness. And so I find it really interesting because it's very murky in terms of proportionality, how you measure proportionality, how you fight these kinds of wars, whether they could be won militarily or need political solutions. So I'm still kind of very interested in war and peace issues, but I'm turning more towards kind of the means of war.
It's very intriguing. As I've looked at this myself, and I'm just as an observer, not as a student in the same fashion as you're carrying out these studies, it seems to me that quite frequently, more so with those asymmetrical warrior leaders, there is this identity that they tend to be captivated with as a leader. And should the war end or the action end, their raison d'etre has been eliminated. And it seems so often that they are identified by the crisis. If the crisis ends, there's no reason for them to be any longer.
Yeah, and so certainly in the Israeli-Palestinian context, one of the hopes is that if we're fortunate enough to have a peace agreement between Fatah and Abu Mazen and Israel, that will weaken Hamas, who kind of rejects a two-state solution, rejects recognition of Israel, and rejects kind of, and supports the continued use of terror tactics as a means in the war. So once there is a peace agreement, the hope is that Hamas will be weakened and it will either lead to its moderation or lead to its inclusion in the Palestinian Authority and in the process of moderation. So that's the hope. But it's a real question in terms of these particular leaders, their ability to change, the conditions of what they will change. And then you get into the whole question of targeted killings that both the United States and Israel engage in terms of our own drone policy. I think in the past few years, that have killed over 3,000 people, and that President Obama has really kind of increased the use of in Pakistan and Afghanistan. In Israel, you have the targeted killings in Hamas. And so often you're going after military leaders, sometimes political leaders, and the question, one of the many questions surrounding it is to what extent that really kind of weakens the capacity and drive of the adversary in ending these wars, or to what extent they're merely replaced pretty quickly by other ideologies, similar kinds of leaders that then don't, only have a short-term temporary effect on the war. So
it's captivating. It very much is. Well, let me shift gears just for a moment and go to the James Madison College at Michigan State. Here's a special place that you happened to arrive at.
2006.
2006. Tell us a little bit about what makes the Madison College significant or special.
Yeah. No, I think it's a wonderful place to be, as you know, because your daughter Amelia was a student there and is a wonderful student in one of my classes as well. But it's a fantastic place. It's a liberal arts college of about 1,200 students within the bigger university. It's interdisciplinary, so we have political scientists, historians, sociologists, economists, and a lot of the classes are looked through a multidisciplinary lens. We tend to have very small classes, usually capped at 30. I have a senior seminar now of 17, and most of the other classes are capped at 30, so we really get to know our students very well. We have lots of discussions in the classroom. We have formal debates. We're having a formal debate in my international relations class on Thursday on policy towards Syria and whether we should have a no-fly zone, whether that will kind of undermine the agreement to get chemical weapons or not. We have lots of simulations. So in some of the classes, in this particular class, there's a simulation of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations where students take on researching Israeli and Palestinian actors as well as U.S. mediators, and they write research papers on the history of negotiations and plans for the future, and then they advocate their actors' interests and often have them represent actors they're less empathetic with so they can understand a variety of perspectives, and they often will find a solution to these conflicts. But it's a great experience to be able to not just be lectured at in large lecture classes, but to really engage in kind of active learning. And our students are very serious, motivated students. It kind of acts as an honors college because the more serious students tend to go there, and they all really want to kind of have a public service or kind of want to make the world a better place and use the knowledge to do so. And certainly your daughter is one of several who's doing that through her teaching.
Well, it's interesting because we had just met for the first time just 20 minutes ago or so. But I recall visiting my daughter at the Madison College a number of times and meeting her friends who are all involved in some sort of proactive work devoted to making the world a better place.
That's right.
There seems to be, among the students at the Madison College, some level of social conscience that is not the norm, not just among their generation, but among many. I don't know if it's something that they're indoctrinated in, or if they just happen to have it when they get there.
I think a lot of them happen to have it when they get there, but they also, they're certainly not indoctrinated, but I think a lot of them, the culture there is they all influence one another. They're all required to do internships, so they often do internships. Most of them study abroad at one point during their Madison experience. So I lead the study abroad to Israel intermittently and had many Madison students come with me over the summer, but they engage in internships and all kinds of experiences that then enhance their interests in doing these things. So we have lots of students doing America or Teach for America, Peace Corps, as well as things in business and government, and a lot of dedication to public service there. So really fortunate. And a lot of the students, since I deal with conflict resolution, a lot of my students have also gone on to do masters and PhDs in conflict resolution and on working on their own research and working in government on those issues. So we're really proud of our students.
That's great, and you really should be, because I think by facilitating that type of analytical, critical thinking and requiring students to address these real-world problems, you're creating the foundation for strong leadership down the road in many areas. And I suspect that your students are much more advanced in terms of being able to solve problems than other students in other colleges. They're also more independent, willing to take on tasks that others might be intimidated by. Do you think that those are accurate assessments? I realize you're biased, but
I am. No, I think they do show a lot of initiative. And, we do emphasize a lot of writing and oral presentations as well, so they get used to that in their academics, and they're all involved in a lot of extracurricular outside too. So for instance, we have the International Relations Organization, which is mostly Madison students, which is now top 10 in the country, and in Canada, where they deal in model UN kind of conferences and things like that. So they're all kind of involved in so many activities outside of class as well. And then they use those alumni networks to find people who are working in the areas that they're interested in. But they really have become leaders. They're judges and politicians and non-governmental organization leaders in Michigan and across the country. Yeah.
Well, we need to figure out how to get geography in there, I'll tell you. That would really work out well, I think, especially since many of these students are majoring in international relations and that new major, relatively new, comparative cultures.
Yeah.
But there's no physical geography requirement to me. I don't get it, but I'm a geographer.
There might be a need for that, and there's certainly outside of Madison at MSU that students can, take those classes, and many of them do. But you're right, though, they're going to use a geographer at Madison.
Just a suggestion, I'll tell you.
Right.
Well, you have this reputation as being a great teacher, okay? You were my daughter's favorite teacher. She talked about you, and I said, all right, so what's so great about her? And she would tell me a few things here, and I said, oh, really? And I was looking at your Vita. You got this this big teaching award just a couple of years ago. What was it? It was like God's gift to teaching in Madison or something?
No,
or what was it?
It was, first of all, Madison is filled with great teachers, so we're really, I think I'm fortunate to be a place where teaching is the priority, and everyone is very dedicated to spending lots of time in class, outside of class with students. So I'm certainly in a culture that supports that and rewards that and is full of wonderful teachers, so that really helped me as well. But yeah, my husband and I both, he teaches at MSU as well in the Humanities Residential College, and we both got this award in 2011, so we're 2 of 6 people for that year, and we were really thrilled to be able to especially get it together, so that was really nice. But I think we're just, both very dedicated to our students and really enjoy teaching. So
you have this passion for teaching, and you have this desire to instill within your students a desire to learn. And do you have any suggestions for other teachers at the college level?
Not really. I think everyone, has their own teaching style, and what works for one person doesn't work for another. And there's so many wonderful teachers. So I don't, necessarily, I'm humble about my efforts, but certainly I think it's the small classes at Madison's that allow you to get to know your students better, which I really enjoy and appreciate. And I have lunch with students every week and invite all of my classes over to my home. So I just really try to get to know them as people, and so I can advise them in terms of their futures and support them in their goals and things of that sort. And I think study abroad also allows you that kind of experience to get to know students in a much, deeper and different way. So
that intimate experience enables one to be more empathetic toward the needs of individual students.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've run out of time. I thank you very much for being here today, and we look forward to your talk tonight.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.